So we're going to go over how to graph just the basic y equals sine x. And I want you to remember that when you graph this, I want you to visualize Freddy the Frog. On the mill wheel. So the whole idea with Freddy the Frog was that the maximum was 1 meter up at the top, and the minimum was 1 meter below the water down at the bottom. And if you remember, Freddy was going around in a circle. And the water level was here, and that's where the axis is. And Freddy was starting here, and he was turning in a counterclockwise direction, and the amplitude was 1, so the maximum was 1 and the minimum was -1. And as he went around, there were 4 key points. So once he started on the axis, the next point was up at the maximum, the next point was at the axis, the next point was at the minimum, and the next point was back at the axis. So those were the 4 key points. So what you want to remember is Freddy started with 0 degrees of rotation and his height was 0. Then after 90 degrees of rotation, he was at the maximum height of 1 meter. Then after another 90 degrees of rotation, which brought him to 180 degrees, he was back at the axis, which was a height of 0. And after 270 degrees, that was another 90 degrees of rotation, he was at the minimum, which is -1. And then after another 90 degrees of rotation, he was at 360, and he is back at the axis. And that graph looks like this. So that is called a sine curve. That is 1 full rotation. And I want you to remember, it's always axis, max, axis, min, axis. And the basic sine graph is starting at 0, and then goes up to 1, and then 0, -1, and 0. Then this will continue. So every 90 degrees, your key points change. And when you graph this, unless told otherwise, you always continue for as much graph as you have. So this graph goes all the way to 720, so you're going to go all the way, and you're going to continue on the left side as well. And remember, going on the left side is like Freddy going backwards. So instead of going counterclockwise, he's going to go clockwise. So he would be going down. So at 90 degrees on the negative side, he would be at -1. And that's going to end up following the same pattern. So if you were asked to draw the graph of y equals sine x, this is what it should look like. So smooth curves. Let me just do this one over again. Smooth curves. Doesn't have to be perfect, as long as it doesn't look like a zigzag. And you should always graph it all the way to the left and all the way to the right. And you want to remember that this right here is 1 cycle of the main sine graph. So a couple of properties that you want to remember is the maximum is at 1. So that's the maximum up here. And the minimum is at -1. The period is the length of one cycle. So the period is 360 degrees. And I want you to think about that and think about that making sense, because as Freddy the Frog goes around the wheel, it's going to take him 360 degrees to go all the way around the wheel. So the period is 360. And you want to remember that your key points change every 90 degrees. Next, the y-intercept is right here. So the y-intercept is 0 because Freddy starts at the water level, so his height at the beginning is 0. The amplitude is 1. So the distance from the center to the max, and also the distance from the center to the min, that is 1. The equation of the axis, that is the water line. And the water line goes along here. So the equation of the axis is at y equals 0. Now the x-intercepts are here, here, all here. And you'll see that they happen at 0 and then 180 degrees and then 360 degrees, etc. Got to put the dots in there to show that it goes on and on. And on the other side, it would be -180 degrees, -360 degrees, and ... to show that it goes on and on. And the domain and range. So because this goes on forever, left to right, the domain would be XER. And for the range, the minimum was -1, and the maximum was 1. And then YER, because it's continuous, it's everything in between, there's no breaks in between -1 and 1. So what you have to be able to do is within 30 seconds draw this graph. For later on, we're going to be getting into transformations. You want to be able to draw this graph after about 30 seconds, and you want to be able to, not within 30 seconds, but be able to state what the properties are. So all of these are the properties. So again, if you want to quickly draw the graph within that sort of 30 seconds, just remember, start at 0. Key points change every 90 degrees. So from the axis, 90 degrees you're at the max, 90 degrees you're at the axis, 90 degrees you're at the min, 90 degrees you're at the axis, and keep going. Every 90 degrees, change your points, and then continue on the other side. And then just smooth curve. Doesn't have to be perfect, as long as it looks like it's hitting all the points, and as long as it's not a zigzag. And that's all you have to do. two things you have to remember. Well, the three things you have to remember is that the period is 360. So you have to have that cycle completed in 360 degrees. A lot of people mess that one up and they have it within 180. So the first thing you have to remember is that the period is 360 degrees. Second thing you have to remember is that you're going to change your points every 90 degrees. And the third thing you have to remember is just the pattern of the key points. So axis, max, axis, min, axis.